Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
She certainly lays out a very different vision for the United States than former President Trump does.
Welcome back to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries, and economies like never before, so we created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Stephanie Flanders.
And I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And our co-host, Allegra Stratton, is not quite back in the saddle. She'll be back next week. Adrian, it feels like the beginning of term. We're back together again, and just a few things have happened in the last month or so.
Absolutely. It is indeed the beginning of term. An extraordinary number of things have happened. I think, in particular, the American election has been turned on its head, really. When we left, it looked as though Donald Trump was almost a certainty to get into the White House. Now it looks as though he's the outside candidate. So extraordinary change. Yes,
and we'll see. I mean, he would probably not accept that he's an outside candidate, and even our own swing state polls suggest it's still very much in the balance. But you're right, everything has changed. I mean, what we're going to focus on today is the foreign policy side of the election, and we're going to be talking to a former senior official in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, who you just heard there, Mike Froman, now head of the Council on Foreign Relations. I was struck, Adrian, in Chicago watching Kamala Harris's acceptance speech. There was probably more on foreign policy in her speech than any other one at the convention, but that wasn't a high bar because no one was talking about it very much. What is amazing is, and a function of how quickly this campaign has changed, is the few lines on foreign policy in that convention speech is probably going to be all that we get from her on foreign policy before next week's debate with Donald Trump on September 10th.
In one sense, it's an incredibly frustrating thing because the world is on fire and we're not hearing about these massively important issues. But on the other hand, America's a big country, it's an inward-looking country, and elections do not tend to turn on foreign policy. Foreign policy is an issue for wonks, it's an issue for eccentrics, but it's not the issue that people vote on. People vote on pocketbook issues. So she is doing the sensible thing in many ways. So we know a great deal about her cooking abilities, and we know almost nothing about what she thinks about NATO, except that she's broadly in favour of it.
I should say, although we've all supposedly been on holiday, I can't help noticing that you have still written quite a few columns since we last spoke, particularly relating to Keir Starmer's first few weeks as Prime Minister in this new Labour government. And one thing that has been a theme has been housing, and all these elections that we've covered on this podcast for, through this year, and now looking to the US election. The cost of housing supply has just emerged as this major issue in almost every election we look at. And sort of related to that, as politicians grasp for ways to increase housing supply, there's been this kind of war declared on NIMBYs. And both, Kamala Harris and many Democrats in the convention were talking about raising housing supply. But also here in the UK, a war on NIMBYs being waged by Labour. And you have some reservations about it. You had a brilliant sort of tidbit which I hadn't noticed in your discussion around the NIMBYs in your column, where so that although you said polling suggests that people are far less opposed to new housing developments if they're aesthetically pleasing. Yet Angela Rayner, last seen, I should mention, quite recently, raving in Ibiza, the Deputy Prime Minister and Secretary of State for Housing has imperiously removed the requirement that new buildings should be beautiful on the grounds that beautiful means nothing, really. That does seem like quite controversial.
If you have a party that had, was inspired by John Ruskin and William Morris and people who thought that beauty should be democratized, that there was no reason why ordinary people shouldn't have access to beauty, it seems a pretty terrible thing to say. But she certainly, redeemed herself by her raving this weekend.
We've gone from being fed up for experts with, not caring about beauty. I don't know which is best. But we are thinking about foreign policy, and we're supposed to, on this podcast, be recording any number of elections happening this year. And there has been breaking news from Germany this weekend, 2 state elections that the world probably wouldn't usually pay attention to, in Thuringia and Saxony, but they have both shaken up Germany's establishment parties and the results have potentially also held some pretty significant warnings for Olaf Scholz's federal elections next year. So let's get to our quick on-the-ground conversation with our senior editor in Berlin, Alan Crawford. Alan, thanks very much for joining us.
Hello, thank you, Stephanie.
For those who haven't paid attention to the details, but perhaps don't want to hear all the details, could you just remind us why these two state elections were more significant perhaps than usual, certainly for the rest of the world?
What grabbed the headlines was the fact that the far right has won a state election for the first time since the Nazis in the Second World War. And that, while shocking, is not all that surprising, because the polls have been indicating this was the case, this would be the case for a long time. Also, the far-right party, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, to use the German acronym, is it's anti-immigration, it's largely pro-Putin, and it really seems to have tapped into a vein, particularly in the east of Germany. So it placed first in the state of Thüringen, which is actually a beautiful state, picture postcard towns, and in Saxony, which is the centre of the semiconductor industry. So, you know, there's a significance there in economic terms, potentially.
You've just described two very different states in terms of where we can't put this all down to economic discontent. We often talk about foreign policy not determining elections, but foreign policy and specifically support for Ukraine has figured very prominently in both.
Very much so. There's an open goal, if you like, in attacking the coalition, the federal government in Berlin. It's a three-way coalition that's deeply unpopular. It's led by the Social Democrats, Olaf Scholz is the Chancellor, with the Greens party and also with the Free Democrats, kind of liberal pro-business party. And they all performed disastrously in these state elections. But yes, they're flailing as governments across Europe are over the issue of immigration. And Germany, despite its slow start, it's now also the largest contributor, apart from the US, of military aid to Ukraine. And both those policies, in terms of open immigration policy and helping Ukraine, are deeply unpopular in sections of society.
How does the pro-Putin side of this fit in? How can we explain that?
Well, it's actually not all that difficult to explain. Both those states are in the eastern part of Germany. Polls consistently show that Germans as a whole are in favour of helping Ukraine by a slim majority. But a large number of this majority are in the east, of this minority rather, who are against helping Ukraine, are in the east. And yeah, there's something of a dichotomy there for obvious reasons that, you know, it was the Soviet-dominated part of the country. But there nevertheless is also an allied distrust of NATO, distrust of the US, and frankly, many people, I've spoken to people who feel very uncomfortable with the idea of supplying weapons into a war, which overturned a long-standing German policy, and they feel that that's fueling the conflict rather than resolving it.
But I would have thought if you'd lived under the heel of Soviet dictatorship, you'd be pretty wary of Putin.
Yes, but that's very much a Western perception of how people in the East think, and that gets to the nub of this protest, that they don't feel represented by the establishment parties. Another one of the headlines from yesterday's results was the fact that a party called the BSW, it's named after a woman, Zara Wagenknecht, who is a former communist. That party placed third. It came from nowhere. It was only formed earlier this year, and it comes with a broadly pretty left-wing economic stance, but is also anti-immigration and anti-help for Ukraine. It did incredibly well and could well be in the state governments. So that's an indication of really the way that politics is being turned on its head, particularly in the East.
I mean, just on that point, we tend to focus, and of course, the sort of the world is very sort of transfixed with the Alternative for Deutschland, and obviously with the echoes of the Nazi past. But we shouldn't forget that one of the striking things about these two elections was the strength of the new BSW alliance of the far left, and they're going to play a kind of key role in, if you like, keeping the AfD out of power in these coalitions in the state. So tell us a bit about them.
They almost certainly will do, because, of course, coalition building is extremely difficult when you have a party that scores something like 30% and above of the vote, but is excluded by the very nature of the fact that the other parties refuse to form a coalition. Yeah, the BSW, Sarah Wagenknecht is, she's essentially a populist politician who she is constantly on television chat shows. Nothing wrong with that, of course. But she was found to have took part in very few votes in the Bundestag over the last session. She has really been very politically astute. It's very easy to categorize voters, when they vote like this, but she saw that there was an opening for a party that was conservative in social positions, but not necessarily economically. And I think that she's opened up the way both into government in these states, but also potentially federally at the next election, which is due a year from now, September 2025.
So often the more extremist parties have tended to be on the right and not also on the left in response to recent economic and immigration trends. It's very interesting that we are actually seeing that there in Germany. But the immediate, just quickly, Alan, the sort of the immediate follow-up to this for Olaf Scholz, does it change the way that he's trying to shore up his coalition going forward?
Not really, no, because apart from the fact he's bullheaded and stubborn, then there's a third state election in the east in Brandenburg, which surrounds Berlin later on this month. The SPD, his party, is not looking so bad in that election. The AfD will do well, the BSW will do well, but SPD is not down and out there. And also, as I said, the AfD is not going to enter government in any of these states. So it's a lot of noise, but I think it's important to also look that the centre-right, the former party of Merkel, the Christian Democrats, it kind of held pretty steady. They will probably form the government, the majority party in these states, and polls continually show that they're on course to win the next federal election. So this is not France.
Alan Crawford, thank you so much. He's reminded us that one of the things that has not changed since we last spoke is that there is still no French government, formally speaking, or at least no new government after the legislative election. But maybe in the next few weeks we'll be able to talk about a new French government. Let's get to that conversation that Adrian and I had just a few moments ago with an extremely distinguished practitioner and thinker on foreign policy, Mike Froman, now president of the American think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations, but previously a senior official for both President Clinton and President Obama. He ended up as US trade representative for President Obama in his second administration. And I started by asking him whether we should care that Kamala Harris seems to have been talking about foreign policy as little as possible.
I don't think that's terribly surprising. I mean, first of all, elections rarely turn on foreign policy concerns. This election, foreign policy may play more of a role than traditionally, but I think to the degree that she needs to distinguish herself from both Trump and from Biden, she's seeking to do so really in the area of economics and really in the area of domestic economic policy. Her plan to reduce inflation, price controls, etc., was certainly a stab at saying that she recognizes how important inflation is to the American public and she wants to take action against it.
And in general, the areas where she's not talking about, we should just sort of assume that she's going to be the same as Biden. Is that the general message?
I mean, we don't know yet. I mean, I think she has at least indicated she is willing to go further in certain areas. For example, this price control and price gouging area. In foreign policy, again, we haven't seen a lot of signs that she's going to be in a different place, some different emphasis, including perhaps on the Palestinian issue. But she has been part of the Biden administration. She has sat in innumerable situation room meetings with the president and the senior team working through these issues over the last 4 years. She's traveled on behalf of the administration several times to every continent, virtually every continent. She's met 150 foreign leaders. So she has been part of the Biden administration's foreign policy team for the last 3.5 years, and you would expect there to be a fair degree of continuity, at least in perspective.
But if I'm a sort of undecided voter, if such a thing exists in the United States at the moment, it's very difficult for me to think of data points on which to make up my mind between her and Trump. In this, she's a bit of a blank slate. I mean, she's not quite Biden. I'm not voting. If I was voting for Biden, I'd be voting for somebody with an enormous amount of experience and with great clarity about what his foreign policy is. With her, I'm voting for somebody who's been in charge of the border. Well, that was a bit of a disaster. Who's come down on this side or that side of issues, such as the Palestinian issue, who's deliberately dealing in a world of vagueness and vibes at a time when the world is enormously dangerous. I'm a bit worried.
It sounds like you, as the undecided but highly policy-oriented voter, it may be a rare breed. I think there are certainly thousands of data points to distinguish her from former President Trump. I mean, she is, and she has a long record, whether it's as senator, as Attorney General of California, as vice president, as part of the Biden administration. I think the harder one is to distinguish her from President Biden, but she certainly lays out a very different vision for the United States than former President Trump does.
If you look around the world today, it is on fire. You have two live conflicts on which it feels like these two candidates would have very different approaches. If you're sitting in the rest of the world, what should you expect from a Trump administration or a Harris administration when it comes specifically to Ukraine and the Middle East?
Well, I think the greatest difference is likely to be on Russia and Ukraine, where former President Trump has said he would end the war in 24 hours. He hasn't said how he would do that, but most people interpret that as him signaling to the Ukrainians that support is coming to an end and that they should come to the negotiating table and negotiate the best deal they can with President Putin. Whereas the Biden-Harris administration, I imagine Vice President Harris, if she were to be elected, would continue the policy of trying to provide very strong support for the Ukrainians, working very closely with NATO and other allies to support Ukraine's effort, and ultimately getting to a position where Ukraine can negotiate with the Russians, but hopefully from a position of strength, where they have something to trade, where they have a better situation on the ground. And so I think there's likely to be quite a significant difference. And if you're sitting across the pond, you're a member of NATO, I think you worry quite a bit about what the difference is between former President Trump and Vice President Harris, because its commitment to the alliance, the willingness to work with allies and partners is, I think, one of their fundamental differences overall. When it comes to the Middle East, I think it may be more a matter of emphasis than substance. Both candidates are strongly in support of Israel's security and wants to support Israel in achieving that security. Both want this conflict in Gaza to be over as quickly as possible. Former President Trump hasn't laid out how he would go about doing that differently than President Biden, but certainly this administration has been pushing hard to try and reach a ceasefire, has laid out a plan to do so. I think the matter of emphasis is that there are some small indications that she is been more willing to say out loud what we know the Biden administration has said privately to the Israelis, which is that they've got to do more and better to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza. They've got to do more and better to provide humanitarian aid to the terrible situation facing the Palestinians, and that there needs to be a pathway towards Palestinian self-determination and statehood at some point. That has been the part of the Biden plan. She has said it a bit more outwardly than the Biden administration has. But there again, I think it's more a matter of emphasis than anything else.
Again, this issue of the vagueness and the vibes, has she said anything specific or detailed about her policy towards China, which seems to be quite an important issue?
If you're asking, has she said anything in the last 6 weeks since she was elevated as the Democratic candidate?
Yeah.
I don't think she has said anything more than what she has said for the last 3.5 years, which has been very much part of the Biden administration, focused on investing domestically to build out industrial capacity and competitiveness in absolutely critical technologies, standing firm against China in terms of unfair trade practices, including using tariffs and other tools to keep out Chinese imports in critical sectors, and more broadly beyond economics, standing firm, whether it's on the South China Sea or on enhancing the deterrence around Taiwan. She's been very much part of the Biden administration approach to that. She's gone to Asia 4 times, if I'm correct. She's met with leaders across the region. She's represented President Biden at various regional forums out there. So she has been engaged on the China issue directly, as well as part of the broader policy process.
So we're saying that she's a continuity candidate, but she's a continuity candidate in a world in which there's been a big rupture in policy towards China in the post-Trump years. So this is very different from the old free trading world.
Well, I think the day of big multilateral free trade agreements is probably somewhat in the past, or it's not in the near future. That's for sure.
Says a former negotiator of big multilateral trade agreements.
Of such agreements. And I think part of that is a recognition that the rules-based system proved to be not sufficient to deal with the integration of an economy as big and as important as China's is, as integrated into the global economy as China's is, but that basically follows a different set of rules. And we haven't figured out yet how to adjust the rules-based system to take that into account.
Just to get a little bit, or relate that to the sort of slightly more inside baseball crucial questions like who might get top jobs under either administration. But I think it goes to the Biden administration has been closely associated with Jake Sullivan and others such as, Dalip Singh, an intellectual framework to the instincts that Donald Trump had when he came into office. Quite a sort of new view of industrial policy, but also kind of, as you just laid out, a new view of the global economy, which in some ways is a bit more kind of zero sum. But do you see that continuing under both a Harris administration and a Trump administration?
I think the Biden administration has laid out the beginnings of a framework for both, I go broader than industrial policy, really about the role of the government in the economy, including industrial policy, but also with regard to export controls, foreign investment restrictions, inward and outward, and then trade and protectionism. I think any administration coming in is going to have to deal with a lot of the unanswered questions. For example, I think the CHIPS Act, is pretty popular. It's not broadly supported bipartisan, but it got some support. And the question is, the CHIPS Act is popular.
And that's about increasing the U.S. production of high quality semiconductor chips. Yeah.
And to date, I think it's working quite well. It's crowding in a lot of private investment. So in addition to the tens of billions of dollars of public funding, it is crowding in scores of billions of dollars of private funding. So that's I think seen as a positive. The Inflation Reduction Act, which also was engaged in industrial policy with regard to electric vehicles and other clean energy technologies, that has less bipartisan support. So the question will be, for any administration going forward, is industrial policy a central part of our toolbox going forward? How much are we willing to spend on it? At what cost? Of course, to state the obvious, every dollar spent on industrial policy is a dollar not spent on defense, on social programs, or it's another dollar going to the deficit and the debt, which many consider to be on an unsustainable trajectory. So they're going to have to make these kinds of trade-offs. Same thing with the other tools. Protectionism is the most obvious one. We hate our dependence on China. We also hate inflation and rising cost of living. And the actions we take to reduce our dependence on China, whether it's reshoring or putting tariffs on, is going to exacerbate inflation and the high cost of living. That may be a perfectly legitimate trade-off to make on strategic goods. It may be a less persuasive trade-off to make on clothing and footwear and toys and things that low-income Americans spend a disproportionate amount of their disposable income on. And so, again, I think any future administration is going to have to wrestle with these questions. And the challenge, I think, has been that the Biden administration has been quite disciplined in the small yard, high fence, the restrictions on exports being really quite limited to the most highly powered semiconductor chips and a few other critical technologies. Same thing on foreign investment. But now that the processes are in place, or the precedent has been set, there's always the risk that the yard gets bigger and bigger, that the screen gets finer and finer, and it becomes more and more difficult across other areas of the economy that may not be as strategic.
Under President Harris, is she well connected with European leaders?
She is. I mean, first of all, she's been the lead American going, just as one example, to the Munich Security Conference over the last few years. She's led the U.S. delegation there. She's invested an enormous amount of time in talking with European leaders and engaging on European issues. Her primary national security advisor, Phil Gordon, is a European expert. He's a Middle East expert. He's an expert on American foreign policy generally, but there's certainly no lack of,
which is good.
There you go. All the better. And so there is certainly understanding of the European perspective. Right. And I would just say more generally, and here I do think if Russia-Ukraine is one point of contrast between Trump and Harris, I think another very important point of contrast is just the willingness to work with allies and partners. I think there's a much greater commitment you've seen by the Biden administration than the Trump administration, and I would assume that would continue under the Harris administration.
The other thing I'm struck by internationally, we've spoken about it a bit on the podcast before, is there is still, even with Kamala Harris having become candidate, there's quite a divide between this, very, very broad sense, the kind of business community or some of the sort of biggest players in the business community, and broadly speaking, sort of diplomats around the world when it comes to Donald Trump. You know, the business community, again, broadly generalizing, is surprisingly sort of sanguine, often, particularly big American businesses and big investors and others, about Donald Trump, and even maybe quietly wanting to see him come to office in terms of what he could do for the stock market and for the US economy. And equally, a lot of people circling the wagons, particularly in the G7, but maybe also in other capitals, really worried about what it would mean to have Donald Trump back in office for sort of global security. Do you think both sides are exaggerating?
Well, I think the business community does have concerns about the impact on, whether it's on security or just the relations around the world, instability in relations around the world. But they've sort of made their peace with Donald Trump. When we saw this back in 2016 or 2017 as well, where as long as he delivered on tax cuts and regulatory relief, they were willing to swallow policies that they didn't like, protectionist trade policies, restricted immigration policies, and more chaos around the world. And I think that view still holds largely true. And to be frank, there's been a fair amount of business disappointment or concern about the Biden administration, which they view as, whether it's on antitrust or on other issues, as making life quite difficult for them. And so I think going into this election, there is a view by the business community, and whether it's complacent or not, one can judge, that we got through it the first time. He delivered on tax cuts and on regulatory relief, and that goes directly to our bottom line, or the way we do business, and the rest we can manage around. Now, that may be underplaying the impact of protectionism right now.
I don't know if Mike, if you were in Chicago, I don't think I saw you there, but we've seen since the convention, our swing state poll, Bloomberg and a few others, not a big bounce for Kamala Harris, but certainly she's still doing markedly better than Biden was in many of those places. But when you talk to a lot of the strategists, they point you to the fact that the economy is still by overwhelmingly the number one issue, particularly in the swing states, and that a majority of voters still think that they favor Trump's policies on the economy rather than Kamala Harris. And those same strategists will tell you the only way really that she's going to win is by fixing that. And that means persuading voters that actually Trump's tariffs, for example, his promise of across-the-board tariffs on all imports, are a tax, and they would raise inflation, make the economic situation worse for people. You spent your life trying to persuade people about free trade and explain just those kind of arguments. Do you think it's a lost cause? Do you think they will ever persuade people that the tariffs against China are a tax and will make things worse?
I don't think it's a lost cause, but I think it's a case that you have to really make. And, there's now analysis out there. I mean, when you impose tariffs, you actually run the risk of three categories of costs. I mean, there's a direct cost, which is what people tend to focus on, how much more that Chinese good or the good coming from any other country that has a tariff on it. Remember, former President Trump has announced he's going to apply 10 to 20% tariffs against goods coming in from all other countries outside of China. That the direct cost that a consumer or an importer who's using that input as part of their manufacturing has to pay for it. Then there's the cost of retaliation, which we rarely calculate. But when the other countries retaliate, that's a further cost, particularly on our exporting industries, agriculture and manufacturing, and hurting jobs in those areas. And then there's a third category, which is more amorphous, which is the cost of imitation, where other countries say, well, look, if the U.S. can engage in this kind of policy, then so can we. We can be selective in our use of our commitment to free trade. We can be selective in our use of tariffs. And that's sort of an open-ended envelope. And so, I think the Peterson Institute, among others, has done an analysis of the direct costs, just that first category, and it's a $3,900 bill to the average American family of taking the Trump proposals seriously. That's leaving aside the other two categories of costs. So
I thought you can persuade Stephanie of that case, but can Vice President Harris make that case? She seems to be averse to talking about policy. She doesn't seem to be very eloquent when she does talk about policy issues. She said, can she make that case? Have we seen any sign of her beginning to make that case? Because it's actually quite a difficult case to make.
We've seen some signs. I think there have been some comments about the broad-based tariffs that Trump wants to impose on the whole world. I think, frankly, she's decided that the better economic argument is the one against inflation, which people can more relate to, and they don't tie tariffs to inflation in quite the same way as what's happening with the price of eggs or something, the price of something else at the grocery store, and so or pharmaceutical products or other areas where she can say people are price gouging. And so that's been her primary line of attack so far.
So she's gone for the bad economic argument rather than the good one.
Well,
sometimes that happens in election campaigns.
Going after the right issue. I think the question is, I don't have a license to practice politics, as one of my former colleagues used to say. So I'll leave that to others. But just remember, we have 75 days, I believe. Again, campaigns don't turn completely on policy as much as we policy wonks would like to think that they do. I think given how recent she became the nominee and the front runner, the fact that they're beginning to lay out these ideas is good, but they also just want to get to know her as a person and hold that character up against the character of the alternative candidate and see who they're most comfortable with. The president here, as you know, plays multiple roles, not just sort of policy leader in charge, but is head of state and represents the country. And I think that's a lot of what Americans think through. Do they feel comfortable with former President Trump as leader? Do they feel comfortable with Vice President Harris as leader?
Thank you very much, Mike. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and Adrian Wooldridge. It was produced by Summer Sadi, with production support from Isabella Ward and sound design by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Noonan is our executive producer, and Sage Bowman is the head of Bloomberg Podcasts, with special thanks to Michael Froman and Alan Crawford. Please do subscribe and rate highly our podcast wherever you get it.